Well, good morning and welcome to another of our series of interviews where we take the opportunity of talking with eminent members of the Fuellers Company. Now today our subject is past master Stuart Goldsmith, who was master in 2011 and has just finished being chairman of our charitable trust. Stuart has had a glittering career in the City of London and elsewhere, and we're looking forward to talking with him this morning. Well, Stuart, good morning. It's very kind of you to come for our interview. So we are roughly the same age group. It will be fascinating to see where your life started.
Okay, well, I'm a sort of wartime baby. I'm that old, and one of the effects of that is I never knew my father. So I was brought up by my mother and to her parents, my grandparents. And so my first memories are living in a house with the three of them. And it was very interesting because when I started going to school, pretty well everyone else did have two parents. And I only had one. But somehow I never felt deprived because I suppose because I had the grandparents as well.
Yes.
They were very, very much Victorians, and they were very important in my upbringing. It was quite, I suppose, thinking back, it was quite a strict upbringing. I had to stand up when my grandmother came into the room, for instance.
Good gracious.
And even at the age of 5. But they were very loving, and they cared very much about my ability to get on in life. And so they encouraged me into education as the way to better oneself.
Yes.
And I was fortunate to be able to pass the exams to go to the local grammar school, and that set me, on way for the rest of my life, because then I went to university. And but it all started from a family background in a relatively poor area in rural Kent. So, but I look back on it with great affection now.
I'm sure, because it gave you a code for life almost.
Very much so, very much so.
Yeah.
My grandmother, for instance, bought me, when I went to university, she bought me a dinner suit, dinner jacket.
Yes.
I didn't know what they were. But she said, you'll need one of these at university, and took me to the tailor in Ashford and had one made for me. And I was totally bemused by this. But of course, when I got there, this would have been in 1963 when I went to university to Bristol.
Yes.
When I got there, I found we had a black tie thing virtually every week. So I really did need it.
Yes, very helpful. What did you read there?
I did economics, and at school, of course, I was maths and science, which I suppose was fairly traditional if you were vaguely bright. But I got a bit bolshy as a teenager and decided I didn't want to carry on doing sciences at university. And so I said I'd do economics. And my head teacher was very understanding. And he said, that's okay, but I'm going to choose the university because you need a mathematical economics type of course rather than a discursive one. And he chose Bristol as being, at that time, he claimed was the only university that did mathematical economics. And I was actually fortunate to get in, but I did get in. And indeed, we had to do part 1 of a maths degree. And then I think that made me realize I was not going to be a mathematician. But I did do economics and did manage to get a reasonable degree.
I'm sure you did. I'm sure you did, Stuart. And so, how did you progress with degree in hand? What was your first leanings from a career perspective?
Well, I formed the view that I wanted to go to the city. And again, I think it was partly because I didn't know anything about the city. I did economics because we weren't taught it at school in my day. And so I thought it'd be interesting to do something new at university. And similarly, when we looked at all the opportunities with an economics degree, the traditional ones of going to a big company and becoming an economist or joining the civil service or whatever, I thought, that's all very well, but is there something else? And I can't remember why I thought about the city, but I did. And so I went to, and I didn't know anybody in the city, but I went to the what used to be called the appointments board in those days, the careers advice people at university, and explained what I wanted to do. And they said, "Oh dear, how very sad." And I said, "I'm sorry, I don't quite understand that." He said, "Well, we can help people in most areas, but we can't help you in the City of London, because I'm afraid it's still very much the old school. It's who you know, not what you know. And do you know anybody in the city?" I said, "No, I don't." And they said, "Well, we can give you lots of reference books, of course, with lists of banks and insurance companies and people to approach, but I'm afraid we don't know any people there ourselves." So I was a bit dejected by that. And as I left the interview, the lady who sat at the desk outside, who was a very grand secretary, I think she was probably didn't need to work, and she said in a soft voice, "Excuse me, I overheard that and I expect you're a bit disappointed. I wonder if I could help." And I said, "Well, that's very kind of you to offer, but you perhaps heard that I don't have any connections in the city and I have a feeling I'd like to go and work there." And she said, "Well, I do have a small account with my stockbroker there, and if it would help you, I'd be happy to introduce you to my stockbroker." And that is indeed what happened. She wrote a letter to, the name won't mean anything to anybody these days, it was a firm called Joseph Seabags.
Yes.
It didn't mean anything to me either, but and they did interview me on the basis of her letter, and indeed they offered me a job. They said it would be a good experience for them to have a graduate in their firm.
Fantastic.
So that's how I got my first job, and I suppose you began to realize that who you know can be important on occasion. And I was taught investment analysis by
really?
which was a new science.
Yes.
And I found that interesting, and it started me off the road of looking at company accounts, of course, and visiting companies. Even as a young man, you went out visiting companies and were introduced to chief executives and were allowed to ask all sorts of stupid questions, and they actually replied politely. And then you wrote little pieces to the clients of the stockbroker saying either this was a good investment or it wasn't quite such a good investment. So that's how I started.
Fantastic. And how long were you with them?
I stayed there 5 years.
Yes.
And did okay. I visited a lot of companies. I specialised in various sectors of the economy, which, interestingly, for questions you're going to ask me later, did include the energy industries and capital. We called it capital goods. So it was engineering, electronics, energy, and a few things like that. But of course, there weren't many listed companies in the energy world on the stock market. But I did nonetheless look at the ones that there were, and I remember one called Amalgamated Anthracite, which I used to go and visit. So yes. that was my first introduction to energy, shall we say. But basically, I became deputy manager of the research department at Seabags, and was very happy there for 5 years. But after that time, I thought it was probably time to look for another job. And I answered an advert, I think the only time in my life I've ever done it. I answered an advert from a then very well-known company, but many of the younger members of the Fuhlers won't have heard of them. It was a company called Slater Walker Group, and they were a big financial conglomerate in the city. They owned a bank, an investment management firm, and an insurance company, but they had operations in 26 countries around the world, which included all sorts of industrial activities. They were a real conglomerate. But I was destined for the investment management side, and indeed they offered me a job. They were setting up a new research department, and I became the manager of their new research department with only 6 people in it. And that was very good, real world, because you were servicing the investment managers within the company, and so had to persuade them that my thoughts were useful and would help them to help the investors to make money.
And they were a major company, Stuart, if I may. I mean, it was Jim Slater, wasn't it? And Peter Walker, very well known, lots of media attention, a high performance organisation.
Yes, Peter Walker had left by the time I went there because he became a cabinet minister and you had to resign. But Jim Slater was very much in evidence, and although they employed, hundreds of people in London alone, he insisted on meeting all new members of staff. So I actually had an interview with him before I joined the company. And obviously for the first few years I didn't see him again, but we carried on as a conventional research department, making recommendations for our in-house fund managers. We had unit trust companies, we had a life insurance company, so we had plenty of products to offer to savers. So the research department was important in giving ideas for that. But over time, I became an investment manager instead, and started actually managing funds. And again, funnily enough, that's when energy started flying again, because we had, of course, a number of specialist unit trusts, and I ran several different ones at various times. But one of them was a new energy shares unit trust.
Really?
Which became quite a large one. And that was one of the things I ran. But I ran a number of other things, and gradually got more and more responsibility and ended up as an investment director. So I progressed within the company, and found it very, very interesting. We started traveling in that time too. We're now in the sort of we're now in the mid-70s.
Yes.
By that time, we were starting to think about international investment as opposed to just UK investment, and that was one of the things I looked into. So I started going to the United States and other places to learn a bit more about it. And we started running international funds as well as domestic ones. And that all, again, we progressed in size. The company became really quite large.
Yes.
But then you mentioned they were well known. One of the reasons they're well known is that, of course, they actually came to grief at the end. There was not exactly a scandal, but there was a secondary banking crisis in the mid-70s. And Slater Walker had lent a lot of money to property companies, for instance, that their banking side had, and they were unable to recover it. They didn't go bankrupt, but they became one of the first people to be rescued by the Bank of England, because the phrase, which was used later, but became systemic risk, was a phrase that was used if Slater Walker had gone bust. And
yes.
So the Bank of England actually bought the banking side of Slater Walker for £1 and sorted it out. And in fact, over the years, they got good return on it, because there was nothing wrong with the loans that Slater Walker had made. It was just that they weren't very liquid and couldn't be recaptured when they wanted them.
Indeed.
So that side was sold off, but Hambros and Rothschilds were engaged to sort out the group as a whole, and they were on the board. And another famous, a namesake of mine called Jimmy Goldsmith,
yes,
became the chairman of the company, and that carried on for several years. By the end of that time, I became managing director of the investment management side, and then
you were obviously with them for a long time, Stuart.
Yes, I stayed there for 13 years.
Yes.
And of course ended up basically running. We changed the name to Britannia Arrow, by the way.
Yes.
And that's carried on for quite a few times. We grew quite sharply. We had operations. We bought two companies in the States, a pension fund management business and a mutual fund business. We set up in Singapore and in the Channel Islands. So we had 5 locations, about 400 staff around the world, we became the 6th largest mutual fund company in the UK. And in total, we managed about £4 billion, which doesn't sound a lot these days. There are people out there managing many hundreds of millions of pounds, but we were the 6th largest at the time in the mutual fund industry in the UK, which does seem weird with that amount of money, but that's how it was.
You were obviously very successful, and probably this was a very enjoyable time for you.
It was very enjoyable. Yes, I was there were a non-executive board, obviously led by Lord Ripon, the former cabinet minister.
Geoffrey
Ripon, that's right. Yes, and but I was running this and found it obviously very enjoyable, and we made acquisitions. I've referred to some of them, and created some serious wealth, I'm pleased to say, for the shareholders.
Yes.
Who, of course, had previously lost a lot of money in
Indeed.
because it remained the same company, and it's still the same today. It's called Invesco today, but when I left, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, but when I left, they made an acquisition or two, and they bought a company called Invesco, and in the end, Invesco effectively took the group over and started running it. But yes, I was there for 13 years and had a very enjoyable and instructive time, learned a lot, and made a little bit of money. And in the end, I stood down at the end of 1985. I think I suppose I felt I'd been doing it for a long time. I was 40 years old.
Yes.
I thought it was time for something different. My colleagues were a bit surprised. So I left without anything to do in mind. I just thought I'd set up a little business, get an office and a phone, and see what happened.
That was very adventurous for an investment manager, if you don't mind me saying so.
Yes, I wasn't intending to be an investment manager. I didn't know what was going to happen. So I did just that, and obviously it was a bit of a slow start, as you might imagine. But I was asked to become a non-executive director of an insurance company and a life insurance company, and chairman of an investment committee for another one. So I began to get one or two little jobs, if you like, around. And the phone started ringing with people saying, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, I haven't quite decided yet, but what do you have anything particular that you need any help with? And of course, one or two people said, well, actually, we do. And my first sort of proper job was working for a big life insurance company, which doesn't exist anymore, whose chief executive was about to retire. And the chairman wanted someone who understood the business to do a report on where they were good, where they weren't so good, and how they might do things in future. And I did that for them for about 6 months. And yes, during that time, it was other people did contact me, and I found myself making acquisitions for people. That was how it emerged at the end of the day, because I'd made a lot of acquisitions when I was running Britannia Arrow. People, and indeed a small business that I ran for a while afterwards called Frederick's Place, which had some accountants and stockbrokers and things like that in it, and I ran that for a year or two. So people asked me to actually find them acquisitions, and I became therefore a small corporate finance firm. I got two friends in who are equal partners with me. Same age, we'd known each other for a very long time, and they did similar but slightly different things, and we stayed together. Well, we're still together in a sense now, and we had an office in the city for over 30 years, a small office, keeping well below the radar, never advising public companies, always doing private things, selling business for people who wanted to retire, and finding acquisitions for bigger companies who wanted to round out some areas of activity. It was a very interesting period, and I'm pleased to say quite successful. So that gave me freedom to do all sorts of things. So I started doing voluntary things at that stage in my life. Well, a bit later, I suppose I waited until it wasn't until the mid-80s that I started looking at sort of more voluntary work and things like that.
Yes.
But I had already started doing some work for my old university, Bristol, because I joined a wine club. That's how it came about. One of the first things I joined was the Wine Society Dining Club, because I'm very fond of wine, and they have a number of events and visits and things. And so I went on a visit to, I think it was to Bordeaux, and found a group of 20 or 30 people. And at dinner one night, found myself sitting next to this rather older man who I didn't know, and we started chatting. And he said, "What are you doing?" And we said all the usual things. And I made a comment about my university, and he said, "Oh, where did you go to university?" I said, "To Bristol." He said, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "No, I don't know who you are. Who are you?" And he said, "Well, my name is Derek Zucchi, and I'm the chairman of the Convocation of Bristol University, and you are now on my committee." That
Wonderful.
wasn't exactly democracy in action, but that was my first voluntary job, and I did that for many years. And when he retired, I succeeded him. So I was on the governing body of Bristol for, I think it was 13 years,
Yes.
and that went on until about 10 years ago. And it was a great thing to do, and I was able to help the university in all sorts of ways by chairing the graduate body, basically, which had a role in the governance of the university, but also, of course, was a social club for the alumni. And
of course,
we had
of course.
branches all around the world. We had over 100,000 alumni, and
Good gracious. Yep.
I would visit them and chair various events and so on. Now that did take up quite a lot of time. That was about a day a week in total, and at least one overseas trip a year. So that started me on voluntary work, and introduced me to another aspect to life. And then one day, when my corporate finance business, I was asked to sell a life insurance company which had run into a bit of trouble, that it was owned by a rather ill-regarded Middle Eastern outfit which had gone bust, called the Bank of Credit and Commerce International.
Oh, yes.
And it was a very difficult task indeed, because it was tarred with this
Quite.
although in fact it was absolutely clean as a whistle, and had a quite a distinguished board of directors. So, but in the end, I did succeed, but I found difficulty in getting any lawyers and accountants who would act for us, because they were all acting for various people in the BCCI
Yes.
operation. Eventually, I got Slaughter and May, and they did agree to do it, and they were, of course, one of the top firms in the city. And
Yes.
felt robust enough to do a job of that sort, which they didn't need to do. And I was looked after by the then junior partner, a man called James Cripps. And this is going to come closer to home now. And James Cripps had the reason he was involved, I think, as the junior partner. So he did a very good job on selling this life insurance company, and we got to know each other very well in the course of this. It took over a year, a very hard year indeed. I was running my own corporate finance business during that period, of course, and doing other things.
Yes.
But it did take up a lot of time. And when it was all over and we had sold it, I obviously got to know James a bit better. And I asked, he started asking me one day, he said, do you know anything about the livery companies in the city? And I said, well, actually, I know they exist. I've worked in the city all my life, literally from the age of 21 to, well, I suppose at that time I was must have been about 50, I suppose. I said, yes, I know they exist, but no, I've had no contact with livery companies whatsoever. Shows how interesting it is that you can work in the city and never come across them.
It can happen.
So, well, I'm a liveryman of the Fuellers Company. I said, oh, well, why is that? You're a solicitor. He said, well, I did the privatisation of the National Coal Board. So they invited me to become a liveryman of the Fuellers Company. They are looking for a few more city people. I mean, most livery companies want people who are in the trade, so to speak, or the industry, but they like a few people from the city with a different background, because we are based in the city as a livery company. And I think they'd like to have you. So I said, well, if they want me, fine. So I had an interview, and they invited me to join. So, and of course, as you will know, conducting this interview, I ended up as master, but that's how I got involved in the first place. And all this carried on, simultaneously with my business. And I feel I have been very fortunate, because I've had for some time now, I've had 3 sort of remunerated positions and 3 voluntary positions.
And you spent 10 or 12 years from joining the company in '98 to becoming master in 2011, I think it was. There were committees, presumably. You progressed through committee work, and have you got any highlights or interesting scenarios that you might like to share?
Well, again, I'll tell you, I'm going to drop another name now. The reason that I progressed, because like most new members, I was pretty shy at the beginning, because apart from James Cripps, I didn't know anybody else. And I went to 1 or 2 events, but when you don't know anybody, it feels a bit odd somehow, however friendly everybody is. And so I didn't go to an awful lot. But one year, a master who, interestingly, you interviewed recently yourself, called Doug Barrow, was doing a master's weekend, which we all do, as most people will know. We entertain members of the company, often around our house if we can. But in Doug's case, he took a small group to Southern Ireland, and I'd never been to Ireland, so I went with my then wife Eleanor on this small group, and there were only 6 or 8 people there, one of which was Doug Barrow, another of which was Shravan Joshi, of course,
yes.
a very recent master, and another was David, the treasurer of the company. So I got to know these people, and I think that was about it. There might have been one other couple, but that they were the ones that stick in the memory. And I realised, having spent a week with them, that that there were things I could probably do for the Fuellers Company. I wasn't really much different from them, and so of course, in due course, somebody suggested that I might like to go on the court. And I went on the court, and as you say, it takes a long time to work your way up, but you do. And in those days, we didn't actually have many committees, and we have more now. And I think that's a very healthy thing. We may talk about that perhaps a bit later.
Indeed.
But we didn't have many opportunities to serve on committees. There was the opportunity to become a trustee of the charitable trust that the living company has, and I did do that. And in fact, my period of office there is up at the end of this year as a trustee, because you can only do 12 years on that. So I did that, well, I suppose a bit before I became master, but around that same time. But the opportunities weren't so much for helping the company, and a lot more was done by the court itself. And we all took on various jobs. And one of the first jobs serious jobs I did, which is again a subject going to be very close to your heart. In the year I was about to become junior warden, the editor of the Fueller magazine retired, and there was nobody to edit it. So it was decided that the junior warden of the day would become the editor of the Fueller magazine. With very little notice whatsoever, and so I did it for my junior warden year, just as you've taken on 1 or 2 things in your junior warden year. I found it tough. I will admit to you, I have no experience of editing magazines whatsoever, and getting the contributions in from everybody and writing a fair bit of it myself, I have to say.
Yes.
I did it. And passed it on to my successor. But then fortunately we did find another editor, as you will know, and that worked for a long period of time. So that was my first experience of real hard work for the Fuellers, plus the charitable trust. And that of course did carry on, and I only became chairman of the charitable trust 4 years ago, and
yes,
that was well after I'd been master of the company.
Yes, let's go back to your mastership, Stuart. I was a very new member at the time. Perhaps you can tell us what you felt you were happiest with your year. When you look back on these years, it's normally 1 or 2 things spring to mind to feel, yes, that was quite well done. I'm satisfied with what happened.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I did, in preparation for this, I thought I'd just get out my diary and refresh my memory, because it is some
Yes,
time ago. And I thought I actually have a list of my engagements, which I provided to my successor, Paul Cuttill, in case it would help him, in his year. And I had 128 engagements during the year. Now, that's quite a lot. Now, it's only, of course, Monday to Friday. There's virtually a rare exception at the weekend, one or two, but that's about it. And, of course, you get a month off. August, nothing much happens in August.
this is true.
A couple of weeks off at Christmas and Easter. So that basically comes down to 3 things a week. Now, that varies from a court meeting, which, as you will know, takes half a day very often, to a lunch with another livery company or a social engagement of some sort, and a lot of things that do take serious amounts of time. And so, I mean, the events fall into several categories, I think. And I will answer your question in a moment, but I'll just deal with a few other things that I don't think have been mentioned necessarily by other people you've interviewed. I haven't seen all the interviews, but I've seen most of them. One, of course, is the City of London and the things you end up doing in the City of London because you're the master of a livery company. And there's quite a list of those. I mean, one of them, of course, is the Lord Mayor's Show. And, livery companies often have a float in the Lord Mayor's Show. And the Fuellers has always been on the Modern Companies float. So I was there 3 years as junior warden, senior warden and master. And 2 of those 3 years it poured with rain. And that's quite instructive. So that's one thing you do. Then you go to the Lord Mayor's banquet. And then you go to the Lord Mayor's installation, and you go to Remembrance Day service, you go to the City Guild's service, you go to the Old Bailey, you're invited by the sheriffs to lunch with the judges, and all these things happen just because you're the master of a livery company in the City of London.
Yes.
I'm not sure everybody in the company necessarily does know that. Some masters talk about it, some don't. And the blog that Carrie has been doing, I'm sure when she becomes master, if she's able to carry it on, I'm sure will give more light on that to a lot of members.
That would be very helpful, I think, to younger members.
Yeah. The other thing I would pick before answering your question is the armed forces connections. All livery companies have armed force connections. Again, perhaps not publicised as highly as they might be. And it goes back, for a very, very long time. In the case of the Fuellers, I mean, you try to find connections that are vaguely relevant to the trade of your livery company. Some of them, of course, that's not possible. But in our case, it is, of course. And so we've always had a relationship with the refuelling squadron of the RAF, which was 216 Squadron in my day. It's now, I believe, 10 Squadron. But that's very exciting. So you get to know them. You invite them to various Fuellers events, and of course you end up going up in a training flight if you're very fortunate. The other parts of the armed forces, of course, HMS Sultan, which is a shore establishment which trains our apprentices for submarines and diesel engines and things like that. So there's quite a fuel aspect to that, and so you get to visit them down near Portsmouth. And there's also, of course, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, which we've always had a strong connection with because they have a sort of a boat that refuels ships.
Yes.
And it also refuels the food and drink and so on as well. So there's been a number of forces connections that are relevant to us. And we nearly always give a prize, the charitable fund then will give a prize to the best apprentice or whatever of the year. So there's a whole raft of events around that sort of thing. And and we've often presented a cup. Various members of the company, various past masters, presented cups and medals to be presented to good members of staff of the whatever particular branch of the armed forces it is.
Yes.
So that takes up a certain amount of time, and again is extremely enjoyable, as you will find in your year. But going back to your question, I suppose there's two things that particularly sit in my mind from the year. The first, of course, is my installation. Who could forget that? It's a very grand occasion, and my surname is Goldsmith. I always felt that once I got to know about livery companies, I always felt, well, it'd be rather nice to be a member of the Goldsmiths company. Well, that was not going to happen, but I was, of course, able to use their hall as a paying guest for my installation banquet. And so I hired it for my banquet and had my installation there. And of course, it is a very grand hall, one of the grandest ones of all.
Yes, it is.
And they have wonderful candle-lit chandeliers, which are very special. And I was fortunate to be able to get Lady Hale, then the President of the Supreme Court, as my speaker. And the reason I was able to do that, harking back to where we were some minutes ago, is that she was the Chancellor of Bristol University. And so I got to know her very well during my period as on the governing body of Bristol. So she came to speak at that event. So that is something that will always, I think, sit in my memory. But it was only one day. The other thing that which will stay for a very long time is the fact that I was very fortunate. It was the Queen's Golden Jubilee year of her coronation. The Diamond Jubilee is about to happen, and I imagine certain events are proposed for that. But the Golden Jubilee was a big celebration, and there were two things which many people seeing this will remember. One, there was an enormous procession down the Thames, a big pageant, and it was an amazing thing. I think I read somewhere, and I may have got this number wrong, but I believe there were 20,000 people on the river taking part in this. I mean,
tremendous.
It was led by a canoe from every member of the Commonwealth, for instance. That's just picking one thing out. But a number of livery companies have launches or barges or something, and of course they were all in it. And at the time we're talking about, the Fuellers had I suppose you'd call it a motorboat, which was used for training sea cadets up in East Anglia, which had our name, Fuellers. Sadly, it doesn't exist anymore, but we did support it for a long period of time. And so Paul Cuttill as senior warden and I as master with our ladies were on this boat for, well, it actually was the entire day, because although the formal bit that was televised lasted, I suppose, 2 or 3 hours.
Yes.
The security, as you can imagine, was absolutely intense. And we all had to pitch up in Hammersmith, some weird jetty in Hammersmith at sort of 9 o'clock in the morning to be processed, so to speak, and secured and all the rest of it. Got on the boat, and some hours before we were allowed then to move the boat. The other end of the scale, we didn't get off till about 9 o'clock in the evening, again, because we had to be taken down to the Port of London and all got off one by one down there. So it was a very, very long day. It was also freezing cold and poured with rain.
Yeah.
However, we started off by scuttling in the cabin of this thing. And as you went down the river, we realized there were tens of thousands of people on the bank in the pouring rain. And Paul Cuttill and I looked at each other and said, we can't skulk inside. We must be out there, even though we're going to get wet. Yes, so both of us and our ladies, we stood out for the rest of the time, got completely soaked and very cold, but we did it. And of course, had the privilege of saluting Her Majesty as we went past the Tower of London and the dais that she had there. I mean, she and the Duke of Edinburgh got very cold too, of course. But they weren't giving up. at all. So that day will certainly always stick in my mind, as will the following Monday, which was a bank holiday. And there, the livery companies had the privilege of entertaining the royal family in Westminster Hall. Again, not everybody perhaps knows, but Westminster Hall is one of the largest venues it's possible to have in London. It's only available, obviously, by permission of Parliament. But we, the livery companies as a whole, were given it to entertain the royal family on that Monday after the water pageant. And the deal was that every livery company would have a table, or in some cases half a table, because I think there were slightly more livery companies than were tables. And the royal family would be spread around the hall. But the idea was that the only members of the livery company that would be on the table would be the master and one other person of his or her choice. Everybody else had to be a guest of the livery company, and they must be chosen from the charitable activities that the livery company undertook, the beneficiaries, in other words, of the charitable activities. And this came from Buckingham Palace. This was an instruction, and yes, it was not to be disobeyed. In other words, this lunch was not intended to be a beano for the liverymen. It was intended to show off the charitable work that they did, and the master and the other member of the company were there in a working capacity to look after their guests. And that is indeed what happened. And we were able to find a number of people to entertain. The other instruction was you are not to invite the senior people at the charities. So you're not inviting the chairman of the trustees or the chief executive. You are inviting people who have benefited from it. And with the armed force companies, the armed forces, again, you're not to invite commanding officers. You're to invite subalterns. And this was actually very instructive and quite difficult in a way.
Yes,
we were able to do the armed forces bits quite easily, of course, because we gave prizes to subalterns, and so we were able to get a couple of armed forces people. The obvious other one was, of course, the school, Platanos, well, now Platanos Academy. It didn't have that name then, but because we had a long-standing relationship with Platanos, we had been providing a prize for the best student every year. So we were able, with Buckingham Palace permission, to invite a 16-year-old student to this very grand lunch.
Indeed.
So that was perhaps that weekend, the whole weekend, I suppose has to be the high spot of my year as master, I think, in the circumstances.
And that's very interesting. Very interesting. While we're talking about charity, Stuart, should we pass on to your time and your term as chairman of the Charitable Trust?
By all means, yes. I was invited. I think people knew I was doing some charitable work, particularly for Bristol, so they thought I might be suitable to be a trustee. And so I was invited to become a trustee now 12 years ago. And I did that for the three different chairmen.
Yes.
And during that time, I suppose our main concentrations were to try to get the charity better known within the company and to raise money for it, and to find appropriate things to spend our money on. But we have been really quite a small charity, and at the beginning our funds would only have been a few £100,000. Well, you can still do some good with that, and we were doing good with that. We always had 10 or 12 donations to appropriate places, and these are reported on formally every year, so everybody in the company knows what we're doing with the money, of course. But so it was always like that. But towards the end of the period, when Michael Husband became the chairman of the Charitable Trust, he was very keen to grow it, and I think rather more effort was put into it at that point by him particularly, and we did end up getting some contacts with more particular donees that were, could be ones we could support on a regular basis and develop a relationship with. Because by then, of course, we knew we were going to have a royal master.
Yes.
And that one of the things, again, one is encouraged to do when you have a royal master is to do serious things for charity. And in fact, I believe it was Michael Husband that was responsible for us getting a royal master, because I think at one of the garden parties he popped up and accosted the Prince Edward and said, "Are you a liveryman, sir?" And of course, Prince immediately turned to his secretary. And they said, "Oh, this is not an appropriate time to talk about it, but well, may I be in touch?" And they said, "Yes, okay, you can be in touch." And that was the start of a long process of persuasion that Prince Edward became our royal master. Other masters, I think, were involved as well after Michael, but I believe it was Michael's original idea. So, or at least he was the one who actually did something about it.
Quite.
And so, armed with that, when Michael was chairman, we were preparing for this by developing special projects for that. And then Michael's time came up, and he had to retire as chairman, and I was selected by the other trustees to be his successor. And so during my period as chairman, I suppose I followed on with the things Michael wanted to do. I perhaps have taken a slightly higher profile than he was able to with the members of the company. Partly because I live in London, so it's easier for me, I think. And we have tried really hard to communicate with the members what we're doing, not just once a year, with the annual report, but really regularly through the Fuller and nowadays through some of the newer media, which you've been instrumental in helping the company to get involved with. And that has, I think, had a result that I think most fuelers are now much more conscious of the charitable trust and what it is doing. There's always articles about it in the Fuller. There's things on the various social media about it, which of course we were not doing until relatively recently. For that reason, we've become better known, and the level of donations from members of the company has gone up.
Yes.
We'd still like more, of course. There's still a fair number of the company members who don't support the charitable trust. I mean, it's not compulsory, but charity is one of the aspects of every livery company, and so we do hope that members of the company will support us. So there's still opportunities for people to do that, but we have worked hard at the other side of the coin, communicating with the members of the company. And the other thing, of course, in my time as chairman has been that we have had to implement these special projects for Prince Edward's year as master.
Yes.
And we chose 6 special projects for 6 charities, 2 of which were well known and were existing charities. One was the City University, where we did prizes for postgraduate students doing an energy-related course, and the other is Platanos Academy, where again we've done things for them for years. But the others were newer charities that we selected, and developing a theme, and again after discussion with Prince Edward, a theme of STEM subjects, which we felt you can't get young people really terribly interested in energy as such, energy industries, and indeed to be in an energy industry you probably need to have done a degree in engineering or some related subjects. I mean, there aren't many specialist degrees in energy. So it was agreed that we would, in the Royal Year, have projects that would encourage young people into the STEM subjects, which hopefully may make them fit to help in the energy industries. And we've done that with several named charities, and they've all worked out, I think, extremely well. They've had a special project. You don't want me to describe each project now, but they've all been well publicised. They're on the website, and they're reported on regularly in the various media that we contribute to. So we've had the 6 projects. They've all been supported during the Royal Year, and in some cases we obviously will carry on with the relationship afterwards. The other big event for the last few years, which again started in Michael Husband's time, but I've been fortunate that it carried on, was two very substantial donations. One was a legacy from former chairman of the Coal Board, Lord Cummins, and he left us a substantial legacy in his will. And a second one is the weird Victorian organisation called the Coal Meters, which, unless you've read some of our publications very carefully, you won't know much about. But it was a regulatory body in Victorian times for the coal industry, and of course was populated by people from the Coal Board and distributors and people of that sort. And it gradually lost its functions, but it became a charitable thing in its own right. And so when the Fuellers was formed, the Coal Meters was very much instrumental in the formation of the Fuellers. And it provided some of the original funds and continued to support the company financially until literally a year or two ago.
Yes.
Been very, very important. But gradually we've been able to take over the responsibility for our own affairs and become self-financing. And that left them with a pot of money. And they decided to donate it to the charitable trust. And that's something that's been worked on for several years, but it has now all come about. And that has brought our funds now up to the £1.25 million.
Yes.
Which is not an enormous amount, but it means we can reasonably think of donating 50,000 a year, partly from the income on that, from that fund, and partly from, of course, the donations by our members each year, because we receive regular donations from members of the Fuellers and would like more. So we are getting bigger, or have become bigger, and that indeed was one of the ambitions that Michael had, and which I've been able to carry on and achieve a certain amount during my 4 years as chairman.
No, that's brilliant, Stuart. So looking to the future now, are there things that you feel the company should be progressing, certain areas where you feel that we would do most help and most good?
I think the company is on the right track now. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier that when I joined the court, there really wasn't any other way any member of the company could influence anything or do anything.
Or participate, yes.
Yes. Now, by a succession of masters, since my time, a succession of masters has found ways in which that can happen by setting up various specialist committees and so on. And I think they've been very successful. They've involved a lot more people in the governance of the company, which of course meant they got to know a lot more about it, and what we were doing and so on. And there's a court meeting, as you will know, in a day or two, which will consolidate some of that into an organizational structure. So, I mean, I guess there are, 8 or 10 various committees and subcommittees that people can participate in if they're interested and want to do more for the company. I think that's a major achievement, and it's absolutely the right way to have gone. And I certainly I can't think of any way to improve that, shall we say. So now I think, and recent masters have also been trying really hard, and you're already doing it as junior warden, really hard to be more visible within the company to the members. Again, you know, back in when I became junior warden, it was really only the master that anyone knew. The wardens weren't very evident. Now they've become much more evident. And of course, the internet and the Zoom and all these things have helped that enormously. But again, the company has been clever enough to take advantage of it. And so I actually think the company's in a good place. We are more self-sufficient financially, and that's really only in the last few years. We've had publicity because of a Royal Master. We have a lot more people involved in the governance of it, and many of those people have clever ideas, like your idea to start filming people. and
Well, that's too kind.
Harry's idea to do a weekly blog, you know.
Yes, which has been a great success.
So, no, I think the company is absolutely on the right road. I congratulate all of the recent additions, and I look forward to becoming a backseat member again.
Stuart, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure that the membership are thoroughly going to enjoy your interview greatly. There will be many, many people who will be fascinated to hear of your life and times. And thank you so much for your time, Stuart. This has just been a wonderful session. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it enormously. Thank you very much.